My name is Rob Thompson. Welcome to our lively discussion of the big deal, why we like them, and why they must change. My name is Rob Thompson. I'm from the University of Calgary. We have Tony Harava from the University of Ottawa, and Heather McFadden from Dalhousie University. And we're going to talk about some of our issues with big deals. And of course, a little ways in, this is a lively discussion, so we hope we'll get audience involvement. But to start things off, I'm going to talk about a bit of the history and background of big deals and how we got to where we are now. So the big deal actually arose in the 1990s out of the print serial crisis. The cost of print serials were going up and up in cost, and libraries were having a hard time keeping up with costs. And so they started cutting print journals. And, but happily, this coincided with the major development of technology and the internet, which made online journals easily feasible for the first time. And so in exchange for agreeing to maintain historical print spending, libraries gained access to large suites of e-journals from a publisher that comprised most of or all of what that publisher published. And so that was a big game changer. With all these new offerings, of course, libraries and or other institutions were quite willing to maintain the spending they've been doing to get access to all these additional journals. Because these were complicated deals, they tended to be negotiated by library consortia. In fact, in Canada, CRCN, our national consortium, a library consortium for university libraries, was founded in 1999, specifically to negotiate these kinds of new big deals. So I guess the first thing is, there are all kinds of good and bad things about the big deals. So what's good about the big deal? First of all, there are massive discounts off of list price. Every big deal, of course, is different, but it's not uncommon to see discounts of 60 or 70% off of list price for all the journals in a big deal when you take the big deal. There's, of course, the long tail. Does it matter if you have a journal that people only read once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, so long as when they need it, it's there? There's a certain amount of serendipity with the big publisher. We don't always encourage our faculty or our students to search on the big publisher platforms. But there's a certain serendipity there. You can find all kinds of journal articles in disciplines you may never have thought to look for on your own. So the long tail, people find things in different disciplines. We're always, at least in Canada, we're always pushing interdisciplinary research these days. So you find things you wouldn't have thought of in another discipline. Even low-use journals, what did Ranganathan say? Every journal article, its reader. Every reader, its journal article. So everyone finds something. You get the long tail, everyone's taken care of. And then faculty and students love the big deal, and especially faculty. They love the seamless access, and quite frankly, from a faculty point of view, they feel their institution is competitive. If their institution, no matter how remote or how big or how small, is a player in all the big deals, then they feel they're on an equal playing field, at least in access to academic research to everyone else. So there's a lot of advantages to the big deal. But of course, there's also problems with the big deal. There's no flexibility in the library budget. You have a huge amount of money tied up in a few small deals. Well, they're big deals, but a small number of them. What if there's some new incredible product that your library can't afford because all of your money's tied up in these deals? What if you have to cut your book budget to keep these deals going? There's a lot of issues with flexibility. Of course, there's the cost increases. It seems that a lot of these deals some of these journals or packages go up at a rate higher than the cost of inflation. And even if they just stay at the cost of inflation, those of us in higher education know that we often don't get budget increases, or if we get budget increases, they don't always even keep up with the consumer price index. So often we feel like we're falling behind. We can't keep up. And of course, that's also an issue for Canadian libraries because we pay for all of our big deals in US dollars. So if the Canadian dollar catches a cold or pneumonia like in 2015, all of a sudden things can get painful pretty quickly. And another, of course, is, I was saying how wonderful the long tail is. The long tail is also a problem because the long tail means that you're only getting a few uses for a large number of journals. I mean, I've gone through statistics. A lot of our big deals, you might see 20, 50, or 100 journals in the package that no one's downloaded, apparently no one's used in the last year. And then other journals that are very low use. So how much are you paying for that long tail? Are the costs worth it? I mean, can we really continue to pay to give our faculty access to a journal they might use once every 2 or 3 years? And then a final issue, of course, are non-disclosure agreements. I know there's been a big push in the last few years to reveal more information about the big deal and the costs everyone has. But lots of us still seem to have deals that have non-disclosure agreements. So, I mean, the publisher seems to know. They may be feeling badly for a library in a certain region or a consortium in a certain region and giving them a little extra help. But, you know, we don't know that. We don't know we don't always know if our costs are competitive with everyone else. So there's a number of issues with the big deal. So I think at this point, we have a list of questions. We're going to kind of work down and talk about each of our schools and then talk about some questions. And starting with, I think, the second question, we're going to want to see if we can get some audience involvement and see how some of you are coping with these questions. So I'll just start off. I'm at the University of Calgary. We're using 2016 statistics, so we'd all be comparable. The University of Calgary has an FTE of approximately 30,000. We're a medical doctoral research institution. We have a large number of graduate programs. We're all over the map: the social sciences and humanities, the sciences, engineering, business law, medicine. About 10, 12 years back, we started a school of veterinary medicine, so we even have that. So we have a wide-ranging research all over the map. We're part of CRCN, Canada's National Consortia, and regionally we're also part of COPL, the Council of Prairie and Pacific University Libraries, so we also get journal packages and deals through COPL as well. The University of Calgary is almost entirely, we use English as our language of instruction. We have a few courses along the margins that use French or other languages, but mostly we're an English language university. In 2016, our budget was $9.6 million US, or 12, I think it was 12.7 in Canadian for those of you who are keeping track.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm Tony Harab. I'm at the University of Ottawa, which is in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. So our institution is an ARL school. We have, as Calgary has, a wide range of undergraduate programs across professional areas like law and medicine, as well as all the typical areas of humanities, social sciences, science and engineering. We are the largest bilingual, meaning English-French institution in the world, so we have a special mandate to acquire French resources. At our university, you can take your program of study in English or in French in most disciplines. You can do your assignments in English or in French, and research gets carried out in either language depending on the faculty member, so it's a very distinctive mandate. Therefore, we need to acquire whatever French material we can, whether it's in Canada or Europe or wherever. We have about 38,000 students. And like Calgary, we belong to our national consortium. We subscribe to all the big deals: Elsevier Science Direct, Wiley Blackwell, Taylor and Francis, Springer, Sage, and a few other ones through the national consortium, and a variety of other smaller deals through our provincial consortium, which is the Ontario Council of University Libraries. And we have about 150 staff in the library, including about 50 librarians. So that's a sort of snapshot of our institution.
And I'm Heather McFadgen. I'm from Dalhousie University, which is on the eastern coast of Canada. And we're roughly 2/3 the size of both Calgary and Ottawa. So we have a smaller student population. We have as a result, not surprisingly, we have a smaller collections budget. Currently, it's about $6.8 million, and we're in the unusual and very fabulous situation that we have annual increases to our collections budget. That's the result of long conversations with our provosts and higher administration. Like Calgary and Ottawa, we provide doctoral and both graduate and undergraduate programming with the same coverage as Ottawa and Calgary, minus the bilingual aspect. So we offer the same kind of programming. So for us, the key benefit of a big deal is that we get it at a price that we can afford, which is slightly less than what Calgary and Ottawa would pay. And it helps us make our scholars and our researchers competitive. So that's one of the huge benefits for us. And the other benefit for us is for anyone who works in a technical services unit is that they're easier to manage than thousands and thousands of individual subscriptions. So we'd like to know from you guys, what do you think the benefits are of big deals?
Dave Schmidt from UC San Diego. One thing you didn't mention was staff time and the amount of work that goes into having to select either individual titles and do the licensing and all those things that get much more efficient with the big deal. And that I think is a really big factor as well.
Well, at Calgary, if you were to go over the last 10, 15 years, we have fewer metadata technical services staff. And the reason for that is very simple. I mean, you can use KBART, activate a big deal, and you have access to all those journals. So yes, if you pick apart the big deal and cannibalize it too much, all of a sudden you have other expenses. And so we would certainly feel that at Calgary.
Yeah, it's the same at Ottawa. That's a very good point you made. At our institution, we have 3 persons in an electronic resources team, and if we knew that if we had to take apart one of the big deals and suddenly we had to manage thousands of journals on our own, we'd need more people, because you're managing at the title level in terms of subscriptions, costs, invoicing, claiming, et cetera. It's moving towards a more of a micromanagement approach, which we couldn't afford with our current staff, even using KBART and all the other efficiencies. It would cause some real staffing issues.
We'd be roughly in the same situation. I work in a unit that does everything from acquisitions to cataloging to tech services to e-resources. And the members of that department also pick up circulation duties, interlibrary loan duties, archival duties, so that if and when we do break packages, one of the things we know we are going to face is the staffing implications.
Are there any more comments on the pros and cons of the big deal, or should we move on to our first question? Well, so our first question is, what have we cut or tried to cut in the past? And so I'm going to try to tell 3 very short stories. So as I've already alluded to, 2015 was not an easy year for the University of Calgary. And we were doing cuts all year. And then all of a sudden in late November, we realized that we hadn't cut enough. And so we were told there were 3 large journal packages coming up for renewal. And we were told that we were going to have to cut one. And so we were scrambling, trying to find data to measure the worth of these 3 journals. And finally, we ended up settling on overlap analysis. And so we did an overlap analysis of all 3 of these packages. And we made the decision that, and it's a very popular package on campus, I might add, the Oxford Journal package from CRCan, and so we ended up, it had the most overlap with aggregators, so we ended up cutting it. Of course, we did end up hearing from faculty, and we did end up coming up with a list of, I think it was 20 or 30 Oxford journals that we subscribed to, of course, not at the kind of discounts we would have had before. So a second story, of course, is in 2016, we were still having budget issues. So we were taking a look at 3 different big deals and taking them apart, trying to figure out whether or not we should cancel one. So did a lot of analysis of, and we might talk more about some of that analysis a little bit later. But we ended up settling on Wiley, and so there was a CRCan deadline. We had to notify them on a certain Friday that whether we were still in or not. So we had discussions with our university librarian. He had discussions with the provost. And so the decision was finally made on Thursday that we would pull the trigger. So Friday, we let CRCan know, and then our university librarian let our provost know that we were canceling Wiley. And what ended up happening, of course, is that our provost was in meetings all day, so she didn't see our university librarian's message until late in the afternoon on Friday. And she had a busy Friday evening, Saturday morning, and by late Saturday morning, we were told that she had found some extra budget for us and that we should stay with Wiley. So we ended up contacting CRCan on the weekend, and of course, they weren't going to pass the information on to Wiley until the next Monday. So it was fine, we were still in, and that was all settled. And then another journal package, another big deal we were looking at was Taylor and Francis. We were trying to decide what we should do with Taylor and Francis. And we were very fortunate that CRCan in 2016 renegotiated the big deal for all the Canadian libraries. And you had the option of the big deal with all of Taylor and Francis, 3 smaller big deals, medical, science and technology, social sciences and humanities, or of course an even smaller breakdown into subject packages, each with different kinds of discounts. But so we did lots and lots of analysis, and we realized we had to keep the medical library. Did some more analysis and realized we had to keep the science and technology library. So we ended up figuring out what our top 100 journals in Taylor and Francis were and where they sit in all these different packages. So we renewed the medical and the science and technology libraries, and then we bought some of the subject packages for the social sciences and humanities, managing to keep 93 of our top 100 Taylor and Francis journals. We may have subscribed to a handful of more of those separately outside of the package. And on the one hand, it worked well. We didn't save as much money as we wanted to, but we did get some cost savings. On the other hand, we faced 2 crises. When the access was cut off in January, or faculty found it. Faculty found out about it in early January. We'd had a plan to do a rollout the first full week of classes, but I think it came out even a little bit earlier than that. And so first of all, we discovered that our faculty of education was downloading articles, putting them on D2L, which is our course management system. And so, of course, unlike other subjects, we weren't accurately capturing how much usage the education material is getting. So we ended up having to subscribe to that outside of the package. And of course, this is my interpretation, maybe this is a little bit cynical, but the Department of Geography was very angry about, of course, us cutting the social sciences humanities package. They were not one of the packages that were picked up. And so they were quite upset, and they kept arguing that they were such a small unit that they would never get the usage that they needed to keep that package. And so they were, I almost felt like they were trying to start a bit of a faculty insurrection. And so we ended up buying their package back separately as well, just to keep them happy. And so those are my 3 short stories.
Thanks. So using 2016 again as the baseline, Our collections budget in that year was about 11.6 million, and that year we faced a perfect storm. First of all, we didn't receive annual increase for inflation. We also received a 2% cut across the board, across the whole university, and for the library, because we couldn't cut in the operations budget, so the full brunt of that cut was applied to the collections budget, about $500,000. Then the Canadian dollar was not doing well, so we were losing a lot of money due to the loss of purchasing power. And then thirdly, we didn't have a mitigation strategy for what to do when the dollar dropped even further. So as a result of these factors, we had to cut about $1 million US from the serials budget. So we started with the easier decisions. We looked at our print journals, online journals, databases, and we cut about 540 titles, looking at everything from lack of relevance, overlapping coverage, cost, availability in packages, a whole range of journals and a variety of databases that no longer served our needs, Access Science, Geoscience World, and a few others. But that didn't bring us all the way there. And so in that year, there were 3 packages that were available to us to be cut, namely Wiley, Taylor Francis, and Springer. And we looked closely at a series of data reports that our national consortium prepared for us. They're called Journal Value Analytics packages. And if you were at the plenary yesterday where Ivy Anderson talked about the process they use to produce their journal value methodology, it's a very similar process. So these reports look at cost, they look at use, they look at impact, and basically give you a metric and ranking these journals from each of these titles in a priority order. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it gives you a very good sense of using those proxies for impact and quality, how these journals rank against each other. And essentially, the Wiley titles were ranked much higher overall. About 50% were seen to be either high or extremely high value based on those metrics, whereas for TNF and Springer, the numbers were much lower. Those two cost us together close to about $1 million. We needed to make savings there. We surveyed our faculty and graduate students, about 9,000 in that pool. We got about 30% response rate, and we asked them, tell us what are your 15 essential journals. And so we thought by doing that across the board, we get a good sense of what's core for a large number of faculty and graduate students. And we found there are not that many Springer or Taylor and Francis titles that were really core, about 65 Springer and 28 Taylor and Francis. So we were thinking about canceling those two and working with the subject collection option through Taylor and Francis, but turned out to be trying to put a round peg in a square hole because none of those packages really worked for the titles that we needed. Too many extraneous titles, too many core titles missing. So then we surveyed our faculty again, or we wrote to them. And when you write to faculty through email, it's very different from a survey, and we can talk about that later. But suddenly we got flooded with responses, and there were about almost 600 Springer titles that emerged as important, and about 625 Taylor and Francis titles. And in that context, trying to cut a full package just didn't make sense. And so we found other ways to save money and be able to save those packages more or less at the last minute, almost as Rob was explaining. So it shows some of the challenges and some of the issues and just how you have to work with the data you have and come to the best decision that you can to meet the needs of your community within your budget. So we learned a lot from that process, actually.
So in Halifax, our perfect storm happened in 2013-14, and we did all of the same kinds of things that Tony did in Ottawa. We got rid of low-use databases. We got rid of subscription tools that were primarily used by librarians. We cut our monograph budgets to the core and got rid of one small journal package, which was fairly uncontroversial. It was poorly used. Nobody wanted to hold on to it. And then we had a reprieve where additional funds were provided from the university. This is kind of a common theme you can hear from the three of us, that at some point the university has more money. But that didn't solve the budget problem we have because the Canadian dollar is just vicious on our budgets. And we're a 5-library system, and part of our budgets are centralized. That's where most of our big deals are paid for, is out of the central budget. So anytime that central budget goes up, the budgets for the 5 libraries to buy very subject-specific materials goes down, and their book budgets disappear, and this is very painful for us. So our medical library not last year, but the year before, went through the process of making what then was a quite bold decision for them. We looked at Clinical Key, an Elsevier product which combines journals and ebooks. The journals were almost entirely duplicated in our Science Direct subscription, but we did not have the ebooks, the leased ebooks. So after protracted conversations about what can we do on the price, we decided to walk away from it. So the medical library walked away from a package that was tightly connected to the curriculum. What we did at that point was we purchased, with the money we saved from canceling that package, we purchased, used 75% of the budget in 1 year to purchase replacement ebooks and print books to serve local and distance medical students. Freed up 25% of that budget. In the year we cut the package, and then the following year, since this part of the budget was part of that particular library's budget, they were able to redistribute 100% of that budget. And that allowed them to reacquire a database they had had to drop 3 years previously. They got to pick up Biomed Central again, that had been canceled in another budget crisis several years prior. And they subscribed to Covidence, a database that helps with systematic reviews. And they were able to buy ebooks and print books and more materials that they hadn't been able to buy before. And that was largely a success for us, was to walk away from that package, even though it was tightly connected to the curriculum.
All right, so now we have another question for you. We'd really love to get your input on this. So in relation to what we've just been discussing, the question is, are decisions really big deals typically made in relation to a budget crunch? What does it mean to make decisions around big deals in normal times? And how would you do that? Because we've been discussing various crises we had in relation to different issues, but what does that say about how we make decisions on an ongoing basis about the big deal in quote-unquote normal times? So if any of you have thoughts about that, your experience, or just ideas you have, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm from Georgetown University. I bet I'm not sure what normal times are anymore. But I think the trick to big deals is you have to constantly maintain them and kind of.
Can people hear in the back? Oh, if you could, yeah.
Sorry. I think you have to be constantly maintaining them and updating the title list and changing the title list and you have to keep weeding the field, so to speak, to use an agricultural thing, because just buying it, letting it sit doesn't work because they add titles and take out titles, and you kind of constantly have to maintain and keep an eye on it even when it's still running. So to make sure that it actually represents as best you can the needs you have. And so it's kind of a constant level of work. It's not just a buy it and you're done process. So.
I'm Crystal Hampson from the University of Saskatchewan. I'm interested in the work that you did analyzing the contents of your big deal packages. So 1999, when they started, kind of predates my involvement in academic libraries. But my understanding was that historically the big deals were priced based on historical spend with the publisher. And so I'm just wondering if you found in your analysis, did you find that you were, do you think that you were able to save money because you had begun to pay for a long tail that you didn't really want, or was it that you were needing to save money and so you actually were cutting below what you would have been subscribing to if you had conditions been normal and you did simply do a pick and choose instead of a big deal?
So first of all, I was involved in a lot of analysis with our Taylor and Francis big deal. And with Taylor and Francis, like I've noticed that some of our peer institutions, like every year we can switch out a few journals that were part of our historic spend and switch in journals that we were using more. So we at University of Calgary, for whatever reason, we'd been busy with other things, had never gotten around to that. And so looking at Taylor and Francis in 2016, we felt that a lot of the journals that we would get perpetual access rights to, because they were no longer part of our historical spend, were no longer getting much use. So we've been spending the last 2-3 years trying to take advantage of shifting journals around to make sure that if we ever have to cut a deal, that we have perpetual access to the journals that our faculty are actually using. I've been specifically involved in Taylor and Francis, but I believe we've had similar issues with our other big packages. But one thing we did when we were looking at some of our big journal packages is we would look at how many journals we send our counter data to a company in Montreal called One Science, and they send us back these vast spreadsheets of data, and there's all kinds of different information in there. But one of the things they provide is a score called synthetic use, and so it's kind of it takes your downloads by your students, faculty, and staff, the papers published by faculty, and articles cited by people related with your university, faculty, postdocs, etc., in their papers. And so we get scores for all of our journals, like how valuable or how invaluable, or and we can order them from most important to least important. So for example, I'll pick on Wiley since so at the time we were getting 1,701 journals from Wiley. And so what we would do with our different packages, we would take, well, let's say we only had 70% of that money, and we were subscribing to journals at list price. So with Wiley, we would be able to, with 70% of what we've been paying for in the big deal, we would be able to buy 105 of our most important journals from Wiley. And it's true that if you look at the stats, those journals get more use than the other journals, but you get a lot of usage throughout the rest of the package. So long tail is important to faculty. And I'm not saying that, if you went to the 106th journal, there'd be a sudden drop off, because it goes down gradually. So that's a bit of what we did at Calgary.
So like Calgary, we've used the One Science reports called One Figure, because it's quite important when, for example, you want to swap titles in or out. So through our consortial agreements with Elsevier, with Taylor and Francis, we can swap out a certain percentage, the value of a certain percentage of titles on an annual basis. And so we look at low-use titles annually and see which ones we want to swap out for higher value, so that if we have to leave the agreement, the core titles represent the ones that are highest value. So those reports that Rob has just been referring to are really, really important. We've also sent them our cost information, so they can factor that into the analysis and show us costs per use, as well as analysis of open access availability, usage, synthetic usage, as Rob was explaining, and have a much more nuanced perspective. And add as well that much of this depends on what is your threshold, what is acceptable amount of use, because we looked at, for example, our Elsevier package, and the number of titles that have at least, let's say, 100 downloads a year is something like 600 or 700 titles, and of course the higher you go, lower it descends. But if whatever that cutoff point is that you find acceptable, that's sort of your magic threshold as to what you determine is the value in relation to the cost. And then if it ends up being 300 titles, what would those 300 titles cost you at list price versus the package? And then how does that figure in the pros and cons? So you have to really figure out what is that trade-off between widespread use versus focused use for the titles you find really essential.
So we're not outsourcing that work to One Science. We do a lot of that collecting of the usage data and swapping journals in and out using in-house data. But we find the same kind of patterns, the same kind of challenges that everybody will find when they work through trying to break a package, that we can see shifts over time away from our old print historical subscriptions. But the challenge that we are now facing is how we balance the needs of our arts and humanities scholars with the very real needs and much higher costs of our biomedical researchers. So nothing particularly novel about our approach in that way.
So I guess our next question is, how has the scale of schools projects influenced our approach? Whether we're being realistic or not at Calgary, we always feel we have fewer collection librarians than other institutions. I was at a talk yesterday about collection staffing, and what, like I said, I don't know what other assignments they have and how much they're doing in collections, but we always feel a little hard done. For example, we're often jealous of Dalhousie and a couple of other peer institutions because they have these extensive databases of all their journal usage. And so we cope with that by buying our One Science data instead. And of course, yes, we use the CRKN, JVA, and some of those other reports, overlap analysis, straight counter data. We use all of that, but we buy One Science, the one figure data specifically because we don't feel we have a large staff.
And just to add to that, I think one of the challenges is when you do have a crisis, quote unquote crisis, you have staff who are doing their regular work and suddenly they have to find time to do a large scale project such as analysis of overlap or where you have access, that you lose, where you have no alternate access to an aggregator if you cancel a package or other types of analysis. So how do you then draw a certain percentage of their time so that you can actually do a project that's time sensitive while the daily work has to continue? So you can't just go out and hire somebody part-time for 4 months tomorrow because you've got a crisis. So you have to somehow be nimble enough or try to be nimble enough to have that flexibility or allow your staff to then really be repurposed on a dime to be able to focus on it or ideally work annually on various types of analysis so you have that data ahead of time. That's sort of the goal, but I think we learned from our situation that you have to start planning for that ahead of time or else you're caught with limited amount of time to produce lots of data that is required to make these informed analysis.
So we're tiny in comparison, so it's amusing to hear envy expressed. So I was hired when that perfect storm of budget happened for us, and a lot of my work since then has been focused on collecting data, merging data, and analyzing data. And the database that we now use to manage the data associated with our analysis, we built in-house with one person doing that work. Our IT department is in-house, so we were able to do that. Some very skilled people there, but it took a huge part of my time last year in particular to gather all of the data associated with 6 of our biggest deals and clean all the data, put it all together. It's possible to do with a small staff, but I wouldn't recommend doing it with one person. And as a result, we are growing our capacity by hiring a new librarian. We had a liaison librarian retire about this time last year, and instead of replacing someone to take on all of her subject responsibilities, we have hired a collections analysis librarian who will be spending somewhere between 75 and 80% of her time helping me collect, gather, clean, analyze data, make recommendations to the senior leadership team, the other librarians, about possible ways through a budget crisis we can see coming to us specifically in 5 to 7 years. Our forecasts show us that in 5 to 7 years we will have no money to do anything except pay for our subscriptions. So I'm very much looking forward to her arrival in February. You can do a lot with a small team, but you have to be relieved of other duties in order to do it. You can't add it on top of your existing responsibilities, or at least not easily.
I'll just add to that, that's in our library we used to be traditional in the sense that we had distributed functions. Each library had its own collection manager and collection management librarians, but we moved to a centralized model as of this fiscal, so we now have a collection strategy unit with a head and 2 collection strategy librarians, and that unit will have assessment as one of their key focus elements, because assessment is something that it's so critical, but unless it's actually deliberately tasked it seems to fall between the cracks. And so that unit will have assessment as one of their key priorities, so that we're ready for the next challenge around big deals, evidence-based gathering and analysis of all the options and all the data we've just been discussing. So we've learned we think that's going to make a lot of difference for the coming years as to how we gather data and how we actually make informed decisions.
Does anyone else want to talk about how scale or size of institution has helped them make their decisions, or any questions about what we've just talked about?
I'm Jason Price from the Skelk Library Consortium. So hearing you have 2 collection strategists got me jealous because I think having really people focused on assessment at that level is so critical, and it sort of spurred me to ask a question that's been in my head for years but just came up again, and that is when you were talking about the threshold, and is it 100 uses, is it how many uses is it? We've talked for a long time about the difficulty of translating, IP-based usage to interlibrary loan uses after cancellation. I'm wondering if any of you have considered or done that, or seen recently any studies that you thought were effective in doing that. And then a related question is, even if we do get those numbers, how do we measure whether that's just what the impact of that difference is? And I think that's the quintessential question for me in canceling big deals. It's easy to say, well, there wasn't a faculty uprising, so we were able to keep this longer and worked out okay, but what is the actual impact? And I realize that's a really intractable question, but I thought I'd start with the first maybe.
Well, at Calgary, where we trimmed back Taylor and Francis, the first year after, and of course we canceled the Oxford Journal package, we did not notice any significant interlibrary loan impact after the first year. Second year, interlibrary loans seemed to go up a little bit, but if you were basing it just on interlibrary loan, it didn't seem to be enough to justify that. And I've seen some studies, I think from Southern Illinois University, I think that's where they're from, and they, of course, they cut several big deals, and they didn't notice an impact in their interlibrary loan data. So are they overrated? Are people using Sci-Hub?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that this Sci-Hub is sort of something that's out there we have to be aware of because people are using it. U.S. is one of the largest users of Sci-Hub, even though it's the richest country in the world. And you've got so-called scholarly sharing, where a professor will call their buddy, at the next college down the road and say, do you have such and such an article? So I think that literature shows that there has not been much of an uptick in ILL, where there's been cuts in big deals, which could be the old, the friction argument. The more friction there is, the more obstacles there are, the more, people find other means. They use open access or non-legal versions of articles. They do whatever they need to do. So just to clarify what I said earlier, that our collection strategy unit actually does all collection development, but one piece of that is assessment. So I wish I had 2 librarians focused only on assessment, but it's one of a multiplicity of tasks involving, print management, e-management, everything else. But we're glad we have that unit.
Understood. It's that question that nags that, did ILL not go up because they didn't really need it, or did ILL not go up because they had needs that weren't fulfilled? And that's the question. I think there are things we can do to move in the direction of understanding that better, but it's going to be slow little glimpses of pieces of a big puzzle. But I'd like to see an effort in our industry to do better at that piece of it, because that's important. But that's what this is ultimately all about, is serving the users.
And just to add to one point to that, what we've all heard about over the years is what's called squirreling behavior, where users, they squirrel away articles, but do they read half of them? I mean, it's so easy to download 50, 100, 300 articles, but you may read 10% of them, therefore they count as downloads, but what was the value of those articles, and did they contribute to research? And how does that relate to ILL? We have to physically go out and make a request because you really want that article, so it's the question of use versus value and demand.
So for the one package we have successfully canceled so far, we saw no impact to our ILL stats. And when I'm modeling future scenarios about potential impact of ILL. What I'm doing is looking at where we have overlap, what kind of embargoes are we looking at? And then I'm measuring, okay, can we, if we can't fulfill the need for current year content, and assuming maybe a 25% conversion to ILL, playing with those kinds of models to get at a sense of how bad would it be if we walked away from a big deal. Whether or not we'll ever be able to measure the impact of an unanswerable question about future behavior is an entirely different situation.
So any more questions or conversation in this area, or do we want to move on? Okay. So I guess we may have a question we'll go back on, but our last question is, how have we managed communications internally and externally? And so at Calgary, I on the one hand, I would say we had good internal communication. The collections unit has had excellent communications with our university librarian. Excellent communications with our provost and the deans. So from a top-down level, there's been good communication. At the same time, internally, I'm not always sure that our liaison librarians would feel that they were in the loop. And sometimes that was part of the nature of the big deals. Certainly, this is no criticism of CRKN, but of course they spend a lot of time negotiating a deal, and then the deal is announced and the price, and then you have a matter of weeks to turn around a decision and analyze that for your own institution. I'm sure that's similar with other consortia as well. And so we didn't always feel that there was, that liaison librarians didn't always feel that they had time to respond, and there were times when we didn't feel like we had time to even get them involved because we had to do analysis. The same thing is that I felt that at our institution, deans have been well informed about the library's budget issues, but do they share that down to the departmental level? Do teaching and do the faculty who are out there doing the research, does that message filter down to them? And I've often felt that that's not the case. So I'm not sure how we can do it better, but those are obviously areas where the University of Calgary needs to improve. Externally, with our external users, we have a communications person. For example, a year or two back, there was an article in the Globe and Mail, one of Canada's larger, more well-known newspapers, and 3 university librarians were interviewed about the budget crisis and journal cuts, and one of them was our university librarian. He's been interviewed on CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, both nationally and locally for Calgary area broadcasts. There have been articles in the Calgary Herald, which is our largest newspaper in Calgary. The student newspaper has covered these issues on campus, and with one exception, I would say that most of those articles were they would try to get both sides, and the library side of the argument was well represented. With one exception, I would say that the student newspaper treated us fairly and made sure they got information for the library before they published. So I'd say in those areas, I'd say I felt we were doing fairly well.
So we had a very robust communication plan. We had 8 or 9 different updates from the start of the process to the end. But what happened though is the issue became much more us against them. So the faculty association and students realized that the library budget was being cut. We were going to cut over $1 million for the budget, and so they saw it as a library funding issue. And even though we tried to explain the big deal and the scholarly communications ecosystem, but the complexities and nuances went over the heads of most, and they didn't read it enough because you can't explain it in 2 or 3 sentences. So it became a very polarizing issue, and there was a petition, there were demonstrations, there was articles in the media, which of course the university's administration was very unhappy about, but it became a very simplified black and white issue, as happens in the media, generally speaking. So what I still struggle with is how do you present the big deal and the issues around it, some of the issues we've been talking about, in a way that faculty can understand. So when they react in an informed way, and not just, the library needs more money, but you have to really try to convey something complex in simple enough terms while giving it enough detail. So that's really quite a challenge, because we try to be as nuanced and transparent as possible, but through the comments we got through our survey and from our librarians, for most faculty and students, it was just, the library is being underfunded, the library is essential, and, and on that vein, but we didn't generate the awareness of the scholarly communications dysfunction that we wanted to, and that's something, I think it's a real tough nut to crack. So we did, I think, succeed in communicating very openly and fully and with all levels of the university, but it's just the issue itself doesn't lend itself easily to raising awareness and raising understanding to get informed dialogue from faculty.
So we learned a little bit from watching Ottawa go through what it went through. We went through similar kinds of protests and petitions. So this last year, we have been looking at 6 of our big deals. We put lots of information on our website, lots of stuff in blog posts, built a little video, pitched at students. But I think the key thing that helped us is that over a period of 4 to 6 weeks, I went and delivered the same presentation to 13 or 14 faculty governance groups. So everything from Senate subcommittees to faculty administration. We have an associated university, so I went and delivered the same presentation there. And it was a presentation that covered everything from what is a big deal to what is our plan for assessing these 6 big deals to here's how you can participate. Talked to them, showed them what I call the heart attack slide, which is the slide that explains why we are doing all of this analysis when we're not in a budget crisis, because we know we will be in a budget crisis in 5 to 7 years. And then also pitch to them how they can participate, because that database that I mentioned earlier has a public-facing component. It has a voting mechanism, which we left open to our faculty and students. Everyone had to be credentialed using the university's credentialing system, but then they could come in and vote and make recommendations on more than 7,000 journals. We had a good uptake from that, and lots of understanding being built with faculty about what the big deal is, what it's good for, what it's not good for, what it means for Dow, how we're going to go through the analysis, how we're going to consult with them. And that helped us with some of the blowback. But we haven't canceled one of the big deals yet. Not yet.
I'll just add to that because it's so political, your communication strategy should really keep in mind all the political nuances and how different stakeholders will react and how you could react to their reactions. So I think it's, on the one hand, you've got all your evidence-based information, your analysis, but the politics has to play a part into how you're going to present it, just because it's inevitable that it'll rear its ugly head.
Everything's political. Any questions about this or comments? Anyone have any wonderful communication strategies they'd care to share? So, I mean, what do people feel are the best practices or strategies for managing faculty responses? And we can certainly respond to that from our end. If we'll see what other people have to say first. So at Calgary, I mean, we've bought and, as I said, after we canceled Oxford, we subscribed to 20 or 30 journals that faculty had. We reached out to different departments and faculties, and we got a long list of journals, of course, unfortunately, far more than we subscribed to. But we subscribed to 20 or 30. But it's amazing how almost 3 years later, we still find faculty who were unaware that the Oxford package was canceled, and why don't we have this journal anymore? I guess another response was when the Department of Geography was kind of making some waves. We ended up buying their package back for them, their package in Taylor and Francis. So we have done things like that. We're always trying to communicate. It was interesting. We used to get we used to subscribe to an aggregation of European journals from Sweats, and we didn't cancel that. I mean, Sweats went under, and we lost access to those European academic journals, and we discovered that one journal, because these were all from different publishers, had never turned off access to the University of Calgary, and then all of a sudden they figured out that they had left access on for an additional, I think, 2 years, and then turned access off. And so we had this very angry linguistics prof who thought we had cut their journal, and it took us a while to figure out what had happened, because that journal had been gone for about 2 years, so various things happen, but we try to keep on top of things, reach out to faculty when they have concerns. And it's, the faculty get very busy doing their research, doing their teaching. They're not always the easiest people to reach until they hit their point of need.
So just to add to that, when we did our survey of faculty at this time of crisis in 2016, one of the key findings was that almost 500 faculty and students responded that they need all journals on a specific topic or all journals by a specific publisher. Whereas I question, do they really use all journals from a publisher? No, they don't, but they may think they do. And so there's, perception versus reality. And another issue here lies in that really big deals don't benefit all faculty in the same way, but as long as they get the key journals they need, that's really the elements, the key elements. So it's really a question of balancing needs with costs, and then trying to ensure that you're really distributing the money as effectively as you can.
So lots of communication, more communication than is humanly possible is part of the solution. More than you think is needed, wanted, or you can possibly do for us has been part of the solution. And lots of listening. When they're angry for a reason. They're not angry randomly. They're angry often because they feel threatened, or they feel that their research is threatened, and this stuff is precious to them, as ours is to us. So lots of listening and trying to find solutions to that. So the database that we built, some of the initial feedback we had from beta testers, we invited the faculty to be beta testers for us, was they desperately wanted to be able to not have to give an opinion on all 7,000 data journals in one go. So we redesigned the database on the fly so that they could save their results, come back later. They could also export their results because they wanted to have a record on that. So listening to them and finding ways to respond, even if it means adjusting a development cycle. And I'm going to just do a pitch. Our database is open source, and it is available on our library's GitHub if anybody is curious about it or wants to mess around with it and develop it a little further.
So I may have missed this earlier about that database. When the faculty are looking at each different title, do they have a set of 2 or 3 or 4 different possible responses for each title? Can you say what those are?
So when the faculty or students log in, they can filter out by subject, they can search by title, and then they can, essentially it's a voting system, and they can vote wanted, not needed, or needed. And we saw people making all kinds of choices like that. So we can because of the login system, we could identify that we had a number of chemistry graduate students telling us that there was no need for us to provide accounting journals. Our management faculty would disagree. They can also add comments on every single journal if they wanted to.
Surprise, I guess. So when I was at the Claremont Colleges, I guess it was 6-7 years ago, we went through one of these cancellations. We had a database. It was really helpful to get that direct feedback. We did some filtering in advance of which titles were in there based on what we thought would be most likely to be cancellation candidates. And then we had 3 as well. It was keep if at all possible, nice to have, okay to cancel. And having that data with alongside it, cost per use, embargo, other things that might be hard for them to understand, but just having, that's to me, it seems to me, especially since they are open source, they are available in that way without cost. We borrowed ours from someone else and then tweaked it and made it work. That data is so helpful. If the faculty have the ample opportunity to be that involved, not only does it help you make the decisions, that is a form of communication that this is happening, an important form of it. So I think that might not be as hard as it might sound to do. I think it's possible to do with limited technical expertise, and yeah, it's worth it.
So do we have any comments? So of course, the title of our presentation is "Big Deals: Why we like them and why they must change." So do people have any comments, ideas on the best way to make big deals change? Certainly, I was part of a. Oh, here we've got a comment. Great.
Single libraries approaching these big deals, but there's no been discussion about consortia. So there's one thing about single libraries trying to change these big deals, but what about libraries getting together to kind of change these big deals?
I'll just mention two things that CRKN has done. And actually, I think CRKN had some early success, but we're seeing more success now with the rolling archive with Taylor and Francis. A lot of library consortia fought that, and I think that's there's no longer a rolling archive. People have access all the way back. So there's been success in that. One data project that I think about 20-some Canadian universities, libraries, all members of CRKN did was the journal usage project, where we had a large part of that was a survey was sent out to faculty at these institutions, and they were asked to rank their top 5 or 10 most important journals. So instead of getting a list of 100, they had to be limited to 5 or 10, and that was very useful data. And CRKN still uses that. I think as a national consortium, with institutions of varying size, sometimes we find it a little bit hard, speaking as a member, to coalesce around a certain goal or objective. But when we do, we can make an impact.
I think you've touched upon something quite important, because one of the strategic goals of our consortium, I think of many others, is to help transform the scholarly communication system and not accept the status quo with a bit of tinkering. So I think that is something our consortium has tried to focus on with different alternative partnership models, the project Rob just described, and I know ICOLC has been talking about it, but the question is, how do you actually really bring about transformative change and not just cosmetic tinkering? And a lot of things are on the table. There are a lot of projects, initiatives, partnerships out there, but I think it speaks to the fact that Big Deal is very tenacious, because it really suits the interests of not the big publishers, but for many of certainly the larger schools, the Big Deal is cost effective in a general sense. So how do we make it more affordable, value driven, and try to transform the system while maintaining what's still best in the broad access it provides? Or can we provide access else through another manner? And so I think we really have to think about what are the long-term goals of perhaps breaking up the Big Deal and working on a true transformation of the system.
It's going to be more of the same from me. I think the biggest challenges consortia have is balancing the needs of very small schools and very big schools against middle-sized schools, where speaking for in Dal's case, we're really stretched to cover all of the things we need. But our size means we float to fairly high on a consortial banding level. So we need to think hard about how do we manage the middle portion of banded consortia. Are subject-based collections from publishers a better option for us? Are title-by-title selections within a consortial purchasing model better for us? I don't think there's an easy answer to this. If there were an easy answer, we'd already have it.
Our consortium has really looked carefully at alternates like title-by-title, subject collections, bespoke collections, and it doesn't work on a large scale. It's not really scalable. But it's also about risk-taking. I think consortia making a real decision to strive for new models that really push the boundaries and not accept the system as it is, which really, as we know, benefits a few big players to the tune of millions and millions of dollars in profit every year. And although the big deal does work well in a certain way, but it does do a disservice at a very systemic cultural level. So I think we have to work on that front as well.
I'll just mention CRCan's Taylor and Francis deal, where you had options to buy everything or break things down by subject or discipline. And that was really valuable for us. I mean, on the one hand, I'm sure Taylor and Francis was disappointed that we didn't re-up for the biggest of the big deals, but we were still their customer, still paying a lot of money, still getting a lot of access. So I realize on the technical services side it creates a lot of problems, but I think we need more flexibility. How we get there, I'm not sure. Oh, Yale doesn't have Taylor and Francis. We feel better already, so we're doing better than Yale. We must be good. So, any other questions or comments or concerns? Well, I guess we'll break 8 minutes early. Thank you very much for coming.